Hello and welcome to measurement. This is module 4 for our research and data analysis course. So today we're going to cover kind of a lot of chapters, but 3 of them are just a couple pages. So chapters 5, 13, 6, 16, and then 18. So first, let's get into chapter 5. We talk about measurement principles. What is measurement? This is a process that includes everything the researcher is going to do to arrive at their numerical estimates. Measurement principles for this is really going with quantitative data. So remember, we're quantifying using numbers. We talk about levels of measurement in communication research. First, we have discrete data. This is going to be data that represent the presence or absence of some characteristic. So it either has it or it does not, the characteristic we want to study. So we can talk about it through nominal or categorical data. So this is grouping similar elements together, identifying these elements as distinct from others, and then the data give a name to the characteristic without any regard to the value of the characteristic. So basically it's saying that we are categorizing or giving names to characteristics, but we're not really worried about the numbers, okay? We talk about mutual exclusivity with categorical and nominal data. So people should not be able to identify themselves in more than one category, right? So a great example of this is asking people their biological sex or asking people their gender identity, right? I can't identify as 2 of the same categories, especially if we're talking biological sex, right? I can't be classified as male and female. We talk about discrete data being exhaustive, meaning they represent the variety of characteristics of the people involved. So if we talk about, let's say we're talking about race, right? I'm sure several of you have taken surveys or done something for a job where it asks you to put your race. It asks you which you most closely identify with, right? That's exhaustive because they're trying to give you all of the options, not just white or non-white, right? They want to be exhaustive. So you get to answer based on your actual racial identity. Equivalent, we want our groups to be equal to one another. We don't want groups to be thought of as good versus bad or right versus wrong. Okay. Then we move to continuous level data or quantitative data. These are variables that are going to take on assumed quantity, intensity, and magnitude differing in the degree, amount, or frequency, and then we order them on a continuum. So with continuous level data, we talk about ordinal and interval. So ordinal data is measured by ranking elements in logical order from high to low or vice versa. You might have answered survey questions where it says, please indicate your highest level of education. That was a bad example because that goes back into discrete data. I apologize. It might say, please rank your top 3 choices of positions in this company or whatever it is, right? That's going to be ordinal from highest to lowest. Interval data is going to be data that is measured specifically, numerically, based on scores and values. So with interval, the distance between the 2 points, an interval is the distance between 2 adjacent or continuous data points. So what this means is, if we're using a Likert or Likert type scale, right? What the points of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all of that should be equal in between, right? This is where we run into ratio data. Oh, we'll get to ratio here in a second. I thought it was the first one on here. So like I said, Likert type scales. We're given the statement and then we are asked to respond. I covered this last week. I'm not going to go too much into it. Same with semantic differentials. We locate meaning and we ascribe to a stimulus based on anchor points of opposite words. So satisfied to not satisfied. Then we get into ratio data. And ratio is similar to interval, except that the 0 is absolute. So the intervals between the data points must be equal. But also, if the score is 0, there is a complete lack of the variable. That's why it's a 0, right? So interval data doesn't assume that the intervals are even. We kind of make that assumption anyway, though, but ratio data, the intervals must be equal. That's kind of the difference there. With this, we talk about issues of validity and reliability. We talked about these last week, so I'm going to go through them a little bit quicker. But basically, validity is the extent to the variable that we want to measure is actually being measured. So if I say I am measuring humor in health campaigns, right? I need to make sure that humor is actually what I'm measuring and it's not Schadenfreude or vicarious embarrassment. So we talk about internal validity. This is going to address the relationship between the concept that we want to measure and the process for measuring it. So validity is a matter of degree because the accuracy of the conclusion is drawn from the data. And that depends on how the research is designed and the data is collected. So internal validity. Quite a few years ago, there was a pretty big scandal within the realm of communication studies, specifically at Ohio State University. They had all of these really cool studies that had these really awesome results, and you're like, oh my gosh. The problem was people couldn't replicate that data. They couldn't replicate those results because the results were not valid. The results actually ended up being doctored by advisors, and I'm not going to name names, but it was a whole thing. People legitimately had their doctorate rescinded and had to recollect the data on their dissertation again. So with the internal validity, you really want to focus on we can draw these accurate conclusions from the data because the data is designed and collected ethically and validly. Content validity. So this is all about the degree to which the items in the measurement actually represent the full range of characteristics or attitudes associated with this construct of interest, right? So we want to make sure that we're actually putting in things into our measures that are going to represent characteristics and attitudes associated. We want to make sure that we're not leaving out an entire potential characteristic or attitude because maybe it doesn't fit with ours. So last week I talked about that trigger warning on TikTok study that I'm I guess it's done now. I'm in the process of submitting for publication. With that, we had complete content validity because we asked questions about more than just fear and anxiety. We figured based on the research, because trigger warnings on TikTok are very new, we figured that people were going to be fearful of disturbing content or they were going to be anxious about it. We didn't really find that. Had we not had content validity, we wouldn't have found that people were actually angry that they did or did not get. We had people mad that they did get a content warning, a trigger warning. We had people who were survivors of sexual assault, which was the disturbing nature of the content, right? That felt empowered because somebody else was sharing their story aloud on a open platform, right? So content validity, you want to make sure that you have the full range of characteristics and attitudes. Criterion related validity. So when one measurement can be linked to some other external measurement, we're going to have criterion related validity. So we get into predictive and concurrent with this criterion related. So predictive is going to allow researchers to be certain that the participant responses are going to predict their communication behavior. So with predictive validity, you're not giving off the wall answers. Each participant is not going to be an outlier. We can be sure that the way that you're answering these questions or statements predicts your actual communication behavior. It's what you think, feel, believe. Because if it's not, the data just doesn't line up and you become an outlier. Concurrent validity. This is the extent of the agreement between two measures or assessments taken at the same time, comparing new assessments with one that has, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Comparing new assessments with ones that have already been tested and proven to be valid. So we might create our own measure and we put it up with valid measures. And when doing so, if we're getting similar results, we can say that there is an agreement. This measure, this assessment has stood a test to be valid. We also talk about construct validity. This is assurances that the core concept that was intended to be measured was actually measured. So construct validity is, again, if you say you're measuring humor, you want to make sure you're actually measuring humor. You want to make sure that you are actually measuring what you say you're measuring. We talk about reliability, so the degree of stability, trustworthiness, and dependability. So reliability coefficient, a number between 0 and 1, to express how reliable these measures actually are. So we talk about internal reliability. I talked about Chromebox Alpha last week a little bit. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in depth today. So internal reliability is the degree to which the items in a subscale are going to invoke the same or similar responses from the person responding to that questionnaire. So we use Chromebox Alpha. This is the calculation of internal reliability or internal consistency. You want to make sure that each of the items in the scale actually measure the construct that you say they're going to measure. This means that if you have an off-the-wall example, you might drop that item because it might not have anything to do and it might be bringing your internal reliability down. You can do test retest reliability as well. So you calculate the relationship or the correlation between scores at two administrations of the same test or measurement to the same participants. Okay. So if we are asking participants, we might do the same measurement twice. And you want to have the same or very, very similar scores. And that's going to, excuse me, I'm so sorry. That's going to do the test, retest, making sure things are still reliable and valid. But it could be, I just do two administrations and they might not be the same participant, but I want to see if the answers are similar. That's going to be test, retest as well. Improving our reliability. So with reliability, one of the biggest things is poorly worded or confusing items, right? So we need to make sure that we are rewriting things, we are keeping everything consistent and logical, and we're not using double-barreled questions. So with this, for example, the example I gave last week of I'm happy and I'm satisfied. Well, what if I'm happy and not satisfied? Or what if I'm not happy, but I'm satisfied, right? That can improve our reliability by making those two separate items. I am happy. I am satisfied. Better instructions given to the respondents. So at each item, or not each item, but each matrix table or whatever it is, telling them, I want you to respond 1 to 7 about how you feel right now. And maybe the next one is, I want you to respond 1 through 7 about how you generally feel, right? Making sure those instructions are very clear for your respondents. And you can take steps to make sure that all the measurements occur under similar environmental conditions. Nothing is worse than having great reliability with one scale and not with another because they're not the same due to environmental conditions, okay? So we talk about threats to validity and reliability. First, mortality or attrition. Participants threaten internal validity due to a couple different things. First, membership to the group, right? So if we go back a couple slides, internal reliability is the items of the subscale invoke the same response. So going forward, that is threatened by membership to the group. So items are not going to be hanging together as they should or as we expect that they would, because the person who is being surveyed is a member of the group that we are trying to study. That might attack or threaten our internal validity. Loss of interest or lack of motivation. If they get midway through your study and then they just start clicking 3s or 5s or 7s, that can be a threat to internal validity. They may need to be dropped from the sample. Could also be a lack of motivation. I just want the extra credit. Oftentimes, professors will collect data from students and they offer extra credit in their courses for doing that survey, right? So with that, I'm just motivated to get my name on the list or whatever, and therefore get the extra credit. I'm not motivated for your research. And we shouldn't expect that participants are going to be motivated by our research, okay? We talk about maturing. So participants threaten internal validity because they mature over the course of the observation, especially if you have a long period of time that you're collecting data. We talk about external validity. So these are concerns that are raised by the way that researchers find and select their samples, and that can threaten generalizability. So I've talked a lot about convenience sampling. This is something that many scholars do because we have access, especially if you are in academics, we have access to undergraduate populations. They can do the survey quickly, easily for extra credit in classes, and we can get a lot of data that way. However, it could threaten our generalizability because this undergraduate sample in Northwest Missouri might be very different than the rest of the population of Missouri. Okay. Ecological validity. So we use university students as participants because the study is conducted or controlled in a way that may not be generalized. So that goes back to using the undergraduate populations. We get that ecological validity because we're collecting things that may not be generalized. So we're talking about the method section. This is chapter 13, and let me see if I can move this down a little bit so you can see the pages, right? So with this, we talk about the method section. It's description of how the research study was executed. I have talked about this several times this semester, but you need to have all of this laid out. You want to not give anybody any sort of reason to doubt your ethics or your research process. So first we describe our participants. We describe the setting, the participants, how we selected them, and general demographic. So males versus females, age range, occupation, race, all of that information is going to go into your participant description. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Next, we want to describe that research procedure. So the researcher should describe in sufficient detail what was done in the study. I need to tell you what variables I used. What were the alphas for those variables? Did I do manipulation checks? Did I have inclusion or exclusion criteria? Which I'll talk about that really quickly now, but we will talk about it a little bit later as well. Inclusion criteria is things that the participants must have or must do in order to be a part of the study. Exclusion criteria is things that the participant does or has that we can't have them in the study because we need to control for that. So perfect examples. For my study, I did a study on casual sex at West Virginia, right? This is kind of a taboo topic because a lot of people don't engage with casual sex, or they do, but they lie about it to most people because it is taboo, right? So I might have inclusion criteria of you have to engage in casual sex in order to be a part of this study. Or in order to be a part of this study, you must be in a committed relationship. Or that could be the exclusion criteria. I'm talking about casual sex. So I don't want you in a committed relationship. I want you to be out of a relationship. So if you are in a committed relationship for 1 month or longer, you cannot take this study, right? So describing that procedure in detail. And then describing your variables. So you want to describe all your variables, your constructs that you use in the study, focusing on your operationalization. I am really struggling with that word. These are specific ways that the variables are going to be observed or measured, right? So talking about, well, these are the variables we used, here's how we measured it, here's what we found, being completely transparent. Oops. On to chapter 6. We talk about population and sample. So a population is going to be the units possessing the attributes or characteristics in which we are interested. So everybody in the world who engages in casual sex, right? You possess that characteristic that I'm looking for. Now, I don't have the time or resources in order to sample every single person in the population that meets that inclusion criteria. So we create samples, subsets, portions of the population, right? So I can still have my inclusion criteria, but maybe I'm just going to study it from the undergraduate perspective at a university, okay? This leads to our sampling frame. This is the set of people that have a chance to be selected, right? They meet the inclusion, exclusion criteria. Maybe they have experience with your topic or they don't, whatever you're looking for. So with my dissertation, I wanted to understand how news media further stigmatized individuals who had become addicted to opiates. I didn't find the results I wanted to, but that's because I actually referred to the people as humans. I know that sounds kind of crazy that I called people humans and that skewed my results, but it does. But with this sampling frame, I had exclusion criteria. Have you ever been addicted to opiates? That's going to skew your answers, and therefore that's an exclusion criteria. For the casual sex study I did, I had exclusion criteria of I only wanted to study college-aged individuals. So based on the US Department of Education, individuals ages 18 to 24 are the standard typical ages of college-aged individuals because I wanted to study casual sex on college campuses specifically, right? So that sampling frame, these people have a chance to be selected for my study. They can sign up or they can be contacted directly, okay? We talk about addressing generalizability, which is the extent to which conclusions developed from our data collected from our sample can be extended to the population. Again, we've talked about the issues of we're using convenience sampling, and therefore we may not be able to generalize these results. However, typically you want to be able to draw your conclusions from the data and then extend that to populations. So not just your sample. Oops. Continuing on, bias. So the degree that a sample is not representative, it favors one attribute or characteristic more than another. If I wanted to talk about, I don't know, we'll go with my dissertation. I wanted to talk about the opioid epidemic, right? I did not exclude people who had been addicted to opiates in the past. I didn't exclude them from my sample. What I did do was I moved them to a control or as a control where I wasn't letting their answers impact the overall findings, right? So you want to make sure that the sample is actually representative and you want to make sure that it's not going to favor one or the other. Okay. Replication. So we want to repeat the same experiment with a different sample population. It could be we have the same characteristics that we're pulling for our population for replication, but it is a different sample still. We can do literal replication. So the research study that repeats the exact procedures as a previous study, you're doing exactly what they did, which is important because it shows that it stands the test of time, as well as your procedures are great because I can follow it step 1 to 12, however many it is. We have operational replication, so we attempt to reconstruct the procedures used previously. We are not doing the exact same procedures, but we're going to do something similar because we want to replicate, but not in the exact same way. We have constructive replication. So subsequent studies are going to focus on same constructs or variables, but they use different sampling techniques, different populations to pull those samples from, and different procedures, right? So you have put out this really great measurement, and I want to use that. I want to use that same construct, those same variables, maybe the same measuring, but I'm going to do a different sampling technique. I'm going to create a different population. So it's construct replication rather than literal replication. Next, we talk about a probability sample. So this is the basis for identifying who or what to include as part of the sample. And it's all based on statistics. So we can talk about random sampling. This is the probability for selection being equal. It decreases bias because other potentially systematic selection biases brought to the procedure of selecting participants are going to be eliminated. So with this random sampling, this is going to be something like um, everybody has the same amount of chance to get into either of my conditions with a trigger warning or without a trigger warning. I do not determine who is going into what, right? Probability is completely equal. We have sampling error, so the degree to which a sample differs from the population characteristics on some measurement, right? So my sample may not actually match up with my population like I thought they would. We talk about confidence level, so the degree of accuracy in predicting the result for the population from the result of the sample. So we'll talk about confidence intervals. I think it's this chapter. It might not be. It might be later in the semester. But confidence intervals are kind of this range from here to here that we can be pretty accurate in that and say that it's going to be representative. So with confidence intervals, you do not want it to cross over 0. And that's the 95% confidence interval. You'll see it as 95% CI, right? So with this, if I have my lower level confidence interval at -5, and I have my upper level confidence interval at -2, that can tell me that I'm pretty accurate, that my population or my sample is accurate to the population. But if it's at -2 for the lower level and 3.7 for the upper level, that crosses 0. So I can say it's not really representative. Okay. Um, So confidence interval. Sorry, I saw confidence. And I was like, wait, I thought I just did that. Confidence intervals, the degree to which the result of the sample is adjusted up and down by the amount of sampling error in each direction. So we can definitively say, yes, these are going to be, or no, these are not going to be direct representations of the population. We have simple random sampling. Every person has an equal chance of being selected to participate in the study, not necessarily getting into either of the groups, but you have the same amount of chance as everybody else to get into my study. Systematic sampling, so we determine the number of entries of the population or our sampling frame, and we assign a unique number to each element within the sampling frame. So we want to say that we want X amount of entries into our sampling frame. And of that, let's say we want 5 entries into our sampling frame, right? Each of those 5 elements are going to have their own number. And that's going to show that it's systematic, that we are doing things by the book in order to collect data that is going to be representative of the population. Stratified random sampling, the population is divided according to subgroups of interest or homogeneous groups. So we put our sample into smaller subgroups of interest where we say, okay, this group likes Batman, this group likes Superman, this group likes Captain America, whatever it is, right? We're dividing those population samples into our subgroups and those homogeneous groups in order to understand each of those classifications. We talk about cluster sampling. So when we can identify the population by groups or clusters, and then we can use simple random sampling in each cluster to select our sample, right? So it's taking like multiple steps to get back to that simple random sampling. So now that we've talked about probability sampling, we're going to talk about non-probability sampling. This is going to be sampling that does not rely on any form of random selection. So convenient sampling that I've talked about a lot this week. This is when the researcher selects people who are convenient to locate and identify as potential respondents. This is going to be something like asking college students to take your survey, asking people you work with, asking people within your field, right? These are people that are close by. They might not be direct representations of the overarching population, though. We talk about volunteer sampling. So the researcher is going to rely on individuals who express interest in the topic and they are willing to participate in your research, right? So with volunteer sampling, I kind of like to think about this as like donating blood, right? Nobody can walk up to you and say, okay, you will be donating blood today. Come on back. We're going to go ahead and get this process started. If you are going to donate blood, you need to volunteer for that, right? And so this is what these organizations do. And that's what we do with volunteer sampling. As a researcher, we rely on people who are willing to participate and they express interest and come to us, basically. Inclusion criteria. People are elements that meet some specific characteristics. So I'm not really, I'm not really, because I'm not using probability at all. But with the inclusion criteria, I'm saying that you have to be this age or between these age ranges, or you have to be a mother of two, or you have to be a man in a committed romantic relationship for at least 1 month, whatever it is, right? I'm saying in order to be in the study, you have to meet these specific criteria. Exclusion criterion are going to rule people out or elements from participating based on characteristics, right? So if you are not within this age range, or if you have ever had an opiate dependency, right? These might be things that are going to exclude you from being able to participate, okay? We talk about snowball or network sampling. So participants help researchers obtain their sample because they identify other similar participants. They give you the contact and names for other people who are going to be similar. Proposive sampling, like I talked about last week, it's going to depend on the judgment of the researcher who is handpicking the cases to be included in the sample. So the researcher is saying, yes, we want you. No, we don't want you. With proposive sampling, I think about clinical trials, right? Medical clinical trials, let's say they're trying to come up with, well, a big discovery in the last year or so, 2 years. I mean, I guess it's gotten bigger in the last couple of years, is the PrEP medication for HIV protection, right? So when they're doing their clinical studies, they're going to handpick people to be in that study. You don't just get to be in it for being a human. You have to meet certain criteria, and the judgment is going to be from the researcher themselves. Quota sampling. So the researcher is going to use targets or quotas as a goal for seeking people or elements that fit the characteristics, right? So if we know in order to get the power behind our data collection that we need, we might use quota sampling. So we know we need 250 participants. So once we hit 250, we're done. Or because we know we need 250, we might select to have 350 participants in the study, because you have to expect that we'll still meet quota, but there's a chance that we have to drop like 75 people, okay? Sample size. This is the number of people that we need to observe or collect data to obtain precise and reliable findings. Similar to that quota sampling with sample size, if we know that we need 250 participants, we might not stop at 250 because we know we're going to have to throw some people out. And therefore, we might have a larger sample size. We talk about population validity. This is the degree to which the sample represents and can be generalized to the population. We've talked about this idea a lot this semester already, but we want to, or we at least hope to, have this sample represent this population generally. So we can say, yes, we found this, and you should be looking at this too. So that was the end of chapter 6. Now we get into chapter 16, and it's about qualitative data. So how do we collect that data? First, observation strategies. We have seamless containers. This means that we conceptualize the setting and context before us, and we think about the interaction as a big round oval where things kind of work together, but you can't find the seam that connects them all together, right? It is a big oval, and it's basically seamless. We also can ask questions to aid in observation. So I can ask you, well, how does that make you feel? Right? That's a very therapist-esque type of example, but I can ask you, how does this interaction impact you? How does that make you feel? Okay. We talk about taking notes. We have field notes. These are notes that are going to be created on the spot while the interaction occurs. So you can handwrite the notes, you can text them, you can audio record them, but you're taking notes. Then we have to transcribe those field notes. And I don't know if you have ever done transcribing. It is a long process. So if you are using qualitative research designs for your study, that is perfectly fine, but be realistic with it. Transcribing notes is going to take you a little bit of time if you're actually doing the data collection process. We're not for this class, but you're not going to interview 500 people. You don't have the time, you don't have the energy. You're also not going to want to go through and transcribe 500 interviews. 5-minute interviews take anywhere between an hour and 3 hours to transcribe because you need to transcribe them exactly precisely. So what you can do is hire transcription services, but that costs money. So transcribing field notes. We organize our notes in a way to make the data easier to analyze and compare with other data. So we get everything written out, and then maybe we highlight things that we're like, okay, this seems important. This seems like something I've heard several times, and then we take little notes on that as well. Field interviewing. So this is semi-directed. It is more conversational with the goal of uncovering participants' point of view, right? So I'm not directly asking you a question and then you answer it. What I'm doing is I'm kind of having a conversation with you and letting you run with it. So you can give me anything that you want to share with me, right? They're long or depth interviews, which are face-to-face interviewing. We seek that deep information and understanding about the way people order and assess their world and their interactions, right? So we're asking you maybe a question and we say, yeah, just give all the answer you can. Anytime I talk to my therapist, how have you been? And that seems like such a simple question, but I give long, detailed answers because I know that she wants my point of view in order to help me get better. So we talk about this interview process. First, we have to conceptualize the interview study. We have to talk about the concepts that we want to understand, and we have to kind of get a game plan for the interview going. Excuse me. Then we design the interview. And from there, we can conduct it. So we start asking you the questions. We use this interview guide, which is a meaningful list of questions. We have privacy definitions. We talk about disclosure of behavior and dilemmas and moral reflections. Basically, what this means is I'm asking you questions, I'm recording it, but I'm also letting you know that these will not be used by anybody besides me and my research team. You have complete anonymity into this. You will be referred to as participant A. I will disclose my findings, but I'm not going to disclose your personal behavior and dilemmas specifically, and I'm not going to share any moral reflections on your part, right? We talk about our interviewing technique. Do you want it to be more casual? Do you want it to be more formal? That's going to change how the interview flows. Then we conclude the interview. You don't just ask the last question, get the last answer, and be like, all right, cool, you're done, right? We conclude it and we talk about, okay, so here's my next steps. Thank you so much for your participation. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out, and you give them your contact information. And then finally, I think it's finally, but you go through and you transcribe that interview. So you write everything out word for word, and then you highlight and you underline. You have exemplars, you have themes, you have important areas of interest for you. We also talk about focus groups. So we've talked about interviewing, and I know I've talked about focus groups a little bit in previous lectures, but focus groups are going to be facilitator-led group discussions. And we use them for collecting data from groups of participants about particular topics in a limited amount of time. This might be a focus group for understanding why you like or did not like a specific product. I'm currently watching the People v. OJ American Crime Story on Hulu right now. And they did a focus group about how people were responding to Marsha Clark, I believe is her last name, right? So they didn't like her. They didn't like her hair. They even said that she was kind of a bitch, right? These are facilitator led, and there's smaller amounts of time. So focus group schedules. These are going to be a series of questions helping the facilitator prompt participant interaction, right? I'm going to ask a question and I'm going to leave it open for anybody who wants to respond. Then we talk about how do we select our participants? So what types of participants do you want? If we are trying to gauge reactions about a particular individual, maybe people who are more likely to be around that person, or who are more likely to be representative samples of entire population. Excuse me. And then we have to conduct the focus group and the group research itself. So we want to guide and maintain the conversation. We don't want to monopolize it, though. There's nothing worse than, as a researcher, monopolizing that conversation to where you're giving the data points, you're giving the answers, but we don't want to know how we feel. We know how we feel. We want to be able to set it out into the entire population. We can collect narratives. So narratives are going to be the stories that people tell as a way of knowing, understanding, and explaining their lives. One of the biggest things with cancer research is narratives and how people share their story. This is also a big thing that's becoming more popular on TikTok. You're sharing your narratives, you're sharing your personal experiences. We talk about critical incidents. These are events in individuals' lives that stand out as being memorable, either positively or negatively. So I was actually part of a research study maybe 2 years ago. It was shortly after I got to Northwest. But they wanted to talk to people who had trauma. And I've got lots of trauma, so I agreed to be a part of it. But I talked about my critical incidences. So I'm sure many of y'all know, but if you do not, I do not have parents alive anymore. My dad died in a motorcycle accident when I was 15, and my mom died from cancer when I was 27. These are critical incidences for me. They have impacted my life. They stand out as very memorable experiences for negative reasons for me, but I can tell you pretty much everything from the days that each of them died, right? And they collected that as narratives for their research study. We also talk about ethnography. So we want to use the study and representation of people and their interactions. This is more of a holistic descriptions of interactions in cultural or subcultural group. So basically what we want to do is we want to represent people and interactions or activities in their actual cultural or subcultural groups. So we can do virtual ethnographies. So this is online research methods that adapt ethnographic methods of studies of communities and cultures through computer-mediated interactions. So in ethnography, maybe you go, oh my gosh, excuse me. Maybe you go to Comic-Con and you want to study and understand people at Comic-Con and that cultural and subcultural group, right? Virtual identities or virtual ethnographies, we're going to do so just through social interactions, computer mediated style. We talk about ethnography of communication. So these are theoretically driven methods of ethnography where researchers focus on language, speech communities, and that helps produce highly detailed analyses of symbolic practices, and we can express that in particular structures. So what that means is we study how people talk about things, how people interact and communicate about things, and then that produces the analysis that we want. We also have an autoethnography, which is autobiographical, and the researcher is also a participant, right? So I'm going to talk about cultures and subcultures, but I'm also a participant of it because I'm also a part of that culture or subculture. And then we get into chapter 18. I'm going to move my little video down here. Sorry. So first, these are pages 348 to 350. We want to represent qualitative research. And what we really want to focus on is that crystallization. So with qualitative research, it combines multiple forms of analyses and multiple genres of representation into a coherent text or series of related texts, right? So we want to make sure that we have so many different types of analysis and all the genres that are represented. This is going to give us coherent analysis. This is going to really drive that point home. And then for chapter 18, we talked about writing the method. So first, when was the fieldwork conducted? How long has it been? Next, what is the extent? I'm sorry, my dog is being a little bit crazy. And so he climbed up into my lap. So this is Stanley, if you've never seen him. First, when was the fieldwork conducted? How long has it been? Things can change relatively quickly, so you want to make sure that you're not collecting data and then sitting on it for 10 years, even 5 years. Second, what is the extent or length of your involvement in the interaction environment? So how long do you plan to be in that environment? Third, information about the participants and the communication context and scene. What information do you have about them? You need to write this up within your method section. Fourth, what were the steps and the methods we used for analyzing the data? Stanley, stop. So what steps did we take? What methods did we actually use? And fifth, to what extent the data was triangulated or cross-checked. We want to make sure that things are done ethically and by the books. So we want to make sure that how much was the data triangulated or cross-checked. And that is the end of the chapter. Oh, there's lots of chapters, sorry. The Module 4 notes. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out. And I look forward to working with you next week. Have a great week and see you next time.